Good afternoon, everyone. That's 2 p.m. now, so I think we'll make a start. It's Amber speaking, and I'll intro myself in a couple of minutes. So today's webinar is going to be covering the updates around carbon neutrality schemes and the next steps for existing or potentially new clients. So we'll run through the agenda first as it goes into a little bit more detail. You'll see on the screen we're going to begin with an introduction to ISO 14068-1. We're then going to have a look around the process and timings for moving over from PAS 2060 to ISO 14068-1 for any existing clients. We're then going to spend a little bit of time looking at the requirements for the standard and the key differences between PAS 2060 and the new carbon neutrality standard. We'll then look at the process and the benefits of ISO 14068-1 and verification with NQA, and then we'll finish off by looking at some further support and resources to aid in your journey. There'll be an interactive Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the questions box on your screen. The webinar itself should take around 30 minutes, and then we've got around 15 minutes for questions. So about 45 minutes in total, depending on how many questions we have. Okay, so first of all, a really quick introduction to NQA for those of you that aren't familiar with us. So NQA is a global certification and verification body. We operate and specialize in a range of different industries, and you can see on the slide where we hold a strong position in a number of areas, particularly in America, the UK, and China. So some of the standards that we're going to talk around today, the carbon standards, are what has solidified NQA's position as a verification body, as well as being a certification body, which is something that NQA has done for a long, long time. Okay, so now a little bit of background to myself. My name is Amber Dixon. I am the lady on the left-hand side of the screen, the only lady on the screen. So I am NQA Sustainability Assurance Manager. I've been with NQA for around about 6.5 years, coming up to 7 in May. For the last 3.5 years of that, I have been positioned as NQA's Sustainability Assurance Manager. So what that's meant is I have an overarching responsibility for the growth of the sustainability business unit. Those of you that are familiar with NQA and what we do, you'll probably have noticed that in the last sort of 2-3 years, we've put a heightened emphasis on sustainability and the strategic direction that the business is aiming to go for, which is around sustainability as well as InfoSec, AI, etc. So my role's been sort of heavily involved in that. What that looks like is supporting clients with new application and resources. So supporting our sales team, our marketing team, making sure that initial conversations with clients are helpful, they're pointing clients in the right direction, we're onboarding clients appropriately, and that there's necessary resources out there to support our clients. So marketing materials that you may see around sustainability, webinars, podcasts, etc. I'm heavily involved with. Accreditation projects and compliance. So my role was originally created looking at the PAS 2060 pilot scheme with UCAS, which is really where my job stemmed from and has grown arms and legs since then. So I'm involved in the UCAS auditing that NQA is subject to. I'm also involved in, providing an awareness and understanding of sustainable solutions linked with compliance. So as I said, this really started off with PAS 2060 for us, and that's grown into a number of different schemes, like a few of the ones that we're going to speak about today. Myself, I am trained in ISO 14001, 50001, taken the courses on 14064-1, PAS 2060, ISO 14068-1, and a number of other sustainability schemes as well. Things like PAS 2080, ISO 26000, 2121, etc. So I'm well placed to be able to hopefully provide some updates around the carbon neutrality schemes for you today, and any sort of wider sustainability topics for the future. My contact details are on the screen. So you've got my email address there and my direct line. So feel free to take a note of that and get in touch with any questions. Okay, so we're going to start with an introduction to ISO 14068-1. So as you can see, the full title on the screen, it's ISO 14068-1 2023 Climate Change Management Transition to Net Zero, Part 1, Carbon Neutrality. I will not be reading out the full title every time we speak about this because it is a little bit of a mouthful, as with all of our standards and schemes. But clues in the title, it was released in 2023. Towards the back end of the year, it was in November. It's part of a wider climate change and net zero series. So you can see in the title, Climate Change Management Transition to Net Zero. This is just part one. Part one is focused on carbon neutrality. What we expect to see is that this series of standards is going to evolve and look more specifically towards the journey to net zero, clues in the title, which we think is really positive, that is heading in that direction. So NQA ourselves will be keeping an eye out for all kinds of updates around this, and part one is the first place to start in that series. So it's an internationally recognized standard, which is the highest tier of standards that we deal with. It's recognized and it's credible. The ISO is, quite often standards can start as a PAS, which is a publicly available specification, before going on to a international standard, an ISO. So it's a strong move to see it be picked up by the ISO. So the standard allows for external third-party verification. So that's via verification bodies such as NQA, and that allows for added credibility and assurance in the claims that you're making. So what does 14068-1 actually do? What's the purpose behind it? What's the content? So it provides a framework for quantifying, reducing, removing, offsetting and reporting greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially, it's there to show your commitment and demonstration of carbon neutrality using those different approaches. It's aligned closely with ISO 14064-1. Some of you on the webinar may be familiar with that specification. It is around quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So essentially, it's a standard where you'd verify your carbon footprint, you'd verify your mitigation activities, but you wouldn't go as far as to achieve that state of carbon neutrality through carbon offsetting, for instance. So the framework that's set out in that is aligned closely with this new standard 14068-1, and it just takes it that next bit further for the carbon neutrality piece. It's also closely aligned with ISO 14067. We'll talk a little bit more in a moment around the boundaries of application to this standard, but it's geared towards organisations and products. So the 14064-1 piece covers the organisations and the 14067 covers the products. So it has an emphasised focus on meaningful reductions within a carbon neutrality pathway. So we'll speak a little bit more about what the definitions mean and the different terminology. But the pathway is essentially the goals towards carbon neutrality, net zero, short-term, long-term goals, and making meaningful reductions and utilising advancements in reductions and removals rather than purely looking at carbon offsets. So we'll speak a little bit more about that to come. Comparatively to PAS 2060 then, looking at the two of them, ISO 14068-1 is replacing PAS 2060 as the specification for demonstrating and achieving carbon neutrality. Some of you on the webinar, I've seen some of you on the attendee list. I know we've got some existing clients for PAS 2060, and it looks like we've got some new clients on the webinar as well. So PAS 2060 will expire at the end of this year, and 14068-1 will replace that. We've got a slide on it in a moment with exact timescales, but that's the real purpose behind this standard. It's a revised version and a revised approach of looking at carbon neutrality. So PAS 2060 was not written as an ISO standard. As I mentioned, it's a publicly available specification that was curated through BSI and a number of different stakeholders. And an ISO standard was deemed as appropriate and necessary to come in as a replacement to almost upgrade from the PAS 2060 standard. At NQA, we think the update is really positive. You know, when something moves across to an ISO and has the attention and, you know, movement around it to become a new standard, you know, we think that's really positive. PAS 2060 is a decade old. So I think coming in with a fresh pair of eyes and a newer glance at the standard is really important. The updates look at more recent terminology, and within that having an alignment to net zero. It considers a hierarchy of reductions, removals and offsets. So we'll speak a little bit more about that, but it sort of steps away from purely looking at carbon offsets and takes a more meaningful reduction route. And there's also an updated application requirements throughout each of the clauses as well. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the timescales. So as I mentioned, PAS 2060 will expire at the end of this year. For the moment, applications are open for both PAS 2060 and ISO 14068-1. So if you're a new business that's on the call and you wanted to speak to NQA about carbon neutrality, then you can approach us with either of the carbon neutrality standards at the moment. NQA will not take any new applications for PAS 2060 after the 30th of June 2025. And those that have been onboarded between now and the end of June, essentially, will need to complete their verification before the 31st of December 2025. You know, in essence, after the end of this year, there won't be another PAS 2060 visit taking place. So new applications will need to be taken in before June, end of June, and they'll need to be completed before the end of December. And then any existing PAS 2060 clients will need to complete this year's assessment by the end of the year as well, if they choose to continue with PAS 2060 for 2025 verification. The other opportunity that there is there for existing clients is that they decide to move across to ISO 14068-1 for the 2025 verification. So because each period is treated as an independent verification period, we would essentially just send you over a new quote form for 14068-1, and in 2025 your verification would be to 14068-1 if you chose to. If you didn't choose to, you'd need to work with the timelines for PAS 2060. If you're a new client, you'd simply just need to apply for 14068-1 with the same quote form, and your first period would be with 14068-1 with NQA. So we're going to move on now to 14068-1 requirements and the key differences between PAS 2060 and 14068-1. So you can see on the screen the breakdown of the requirements for ISO 14068-1, which is quickly becoming a little bit of a mouthful for me to say. There are 12 clauses as shown on the screen. Excuse me, and a number of annexes within the standard. So the first three clauses and introduction provide context and clarity around the standard, and once you get to clause 4, the standard becomes more tangible and really what our verification team are looking at when they're conducting their verification work. So firstly, looking at principles, of which ISO 14068-1 has 10. You can see on the screen that's around transparency, conservativeness, or having a hierarchy approach, supporting transition, ambition, urgency, science-based approach, avoiding adverse impacts, having accountability, and value chain and life cycle approach. So those are the 10 principles that you have around clause 4. Clause 5 is approach, and it talks around things such as carbon neutrality framework, hierarchy, pathway, and what must be documented. Clause 6 looks at commitment to carbon neutrality, whereas Clause 7 looks at the selection of the subject and its boundary. Clause 8 is around quantification of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. Clause 9 looks at the carbon neutrality management plan. Clause 10 around greenhouse gas emission reductions and GHG removal enhancements. Clause 11 is on offsetting the carbon footprint, and clause 12 is on the carbon neutrality report. 13 looks at carbon neutrality claims, and then you've got a number of annexes as well. So the annexes are a mixture of informative, so they're providing guidance, and then you've got normative as well, which means that they must be conformed with. So you've got support there and further information around the carbon neutrality pathway, additional requirements for specific cases, comparison between international standards and the GHG protocol, which is a really handy table in Annex C around comparing the GHG protocol and ISO 14064-1, and then some more information on ambition. So the next 4 slides is going to look at the key differences between PAS 2060 and ISO 14068-1. So this, if we spend more time on, you know, the next 4 slides, we could be here all day sort of going through them in quite a bit of detail. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to run through them fairly high level because we've got some time constraints, but hopefully to provide a little bit of an understanding to those on the webinar around, you know, what the key differences are and what the intentions are of both standards. And for those that are already working with PAS 2060, you know, what areas are needing to be updated to work with the new standard. So we'll begin with the status. We've already mentioned, you know, PAS 2060 is a publicly available specification, whereas 14068-1 is an international standard. The terminology between the 2 standards differ slightly. They both use the terms entity and subject, which if anyone, you know, is familiar with the terms within PAS 2060, then, you know, that continues on with 14068-1 as well. There is some differences around when you're talking about the emission sources, so and the boundaries. So PAS 2060 talks about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 when it refers to the boundaries and the emission sources within it, whereas 14068-1 uses ISO 14064-1 terminology. So it talks about direct emissions, which is our scope 1. It talks about energy indirect, which is our scope 2. And then it talks about indirect emissions, which we know as scope 3. So there's slightly different terminology used. When we're considering materiality, PAS 2060 defines materiality as an emission source comprising as over 1% of the subject's anticipated total emissions. So if something, for instance, your employee commuting equated to more than 1% of the total carbon footprint, then that is material. Whereas ISO 14068-1, as well as 14064-1, which it's based on, does not mention materiality. However, NQA is a verification body where we audit using the standard called 14064-3 to provide our verifications. We will confirm that with you. So some slight differences there on materiality as well. So the aims of the standards for PAS 2060, it's very geared towards carbon neutrality only. It doesn't mention net zero, whereas 14068-1 does. It recognises carbon neutrality on its path towards net zero. Some of the positive updates around the standard is, setting those longer term plans, being on a pathway and aligning to science-based targets, all of those things that we're going to speak a little bit more about. It's very much continually aligned towards net zero, whereas past 2060 is not. So we think that that's a positive step forward. In terms of documentation, between the two standards there's alignment, but because the standards have slightly different requirements, the content of what's in each of the documentation is going to differ slightly between the two, and the titles are slightly different as well. So for past 2060, you'll be used to using a qualifying explanatory statement, a QES for short, and a QES has been used, is used to essentially evidence how you've reached carbon neutrality from A to B. Things like your boundaries, your methodologies, your exclusions, your carbon reduction plans and your offsetting, etc. Whereas for 14068-1, it talks about something called a carbon neutrality report. Very similar, it's looking at, the boundaries, it's looking at the methodology exclusions, your approach to the hierarchy, your approach to a carbon neutrality pathway. So the specific requirements within the standard will be documented within that carbon neutrality report. So they differ slightly because the requirements have been updated, but essentially they're both your evidence document that you would keep a lot of your justifications, reasonings, etc. in. The second one is carbon footprint management plan for past 2060. So this is where you're putting in your actions, your goals, your means to achieving your reductions that you have to have year on year for past 2060. And for 14068-1, it's something called a carbon neutrality management plan. Very similar. It's looking at your means of reduction, but we know for 14068-1, which we'll go on to in a minute, there is a hierarchy approach around not just reducing and then offsetting. You have to look to reduce, you have to look to remove, you have to look to offset. So it's more of a robust, meaningful approach to reduction. So there's some slightly different requirements in there. The inventories will essentially, both of the standards require an inventory. For most clients, this is on an Excel spreadsheet. If you're on the webinar and you're an existing client of ours, then the majority of you use a Excel spreadsheet with your different emission sources across the bottom, with your data in, a conversion factor giving you a total figure, and then a total carbon footprint from all of the tabs combined. So that's the same for both of the different standards as well. Some people are moving towards a software platform as well, but predominantly we see clients working with a Excel spreadsheet. So applicability for past 2060, the list is quite extensive, goes as far as to say that individuals and families can adopt the standard. We haven't had any of those, unsurprisingly. No families or individuals have spoken to us to become carbon neutral themselves. However, you'll see some examples on the screen that are a little bit more common. So the majority of our client base are looking for organizational level carbon neutrality claims, but we do have product services. It could be around land use, it could be around projects, etc. as well for past 2060. When we look at ISO 14068-1, it is applicable to organizations and products only. However, products can include goods and services, including events, buildings, bits and pieces like that. So although it says organizations and products only, it's a little bit wider than that. It just falls within the products umbrella. Right, so if we go on to the next screen, we'll talk around boundary settings. So we've got 4 pages on this table. So apologies, it's a little bit tedious and word heavy, but I think it's good to have on the screen, to go through the differences between the standards and have them side by side. So Boundary setting for PAS 2060 talks about having a true and fair representation of, what the organization is looking to claim against, whether that's through an equity share or through what the company controls. Whereas 14068-1, the boundaries are set in alignment with 14064-1, which is an organizational level quantification standard, which we spoke about, or 14067, which is the carbon footprint of products that we spoke about. So the boundaries have to be set in alignment with those linked standards. If there's other standards that are used, they can be permitted as long as they're consistent with the 14064-1 or 14067, and there's an explanation as to why that's being used. So a good example there is a lot of our clients will use the GHG protocol for PAS 2060, and for 14068-1, where it calls out 14064-1, you may still use the GHG protocol, but you would need, because it's consistent with 14064-1, you could put together an explanation and a justification as to why you've used that, but you'd need to ensure that there was consistency when it came to applying it. So the actual quantification process for organizations at this point, for PAS 2060, the GHG protocol, as I just mentioned, is used frequently for, a large majority of our clients. The UK government environmental reporting guidelines is used by all of our clients. That's where you get the conversion factors from, which are super important and critical, and ISO 14064-1 as well. So we've already seen this standard within PAS 2060, but when you go across and look at 14068-1, 14064 is, really the top standard that needs to be used. And again, if that's not, then it needs to be clearly justified as to what other criteria has been used and how it's consistent with 14064-1. So when we look at products, for PAS 2060, you might use things like PAS 2050, which looks at, again, the carbon footprint of products, as does 14067. There's information on the GHG protocol as well. Whereas for 14068-1, similarly, a similar approach like with the organizations, you would use 14067, and if you didn't, you need to justify how it's consistent and why you've chosen to use it. So when we look at GHG reporting, PAS 2060 mandates that all scope 1, 2 and 3 emission sources that are material, so they're greater than 1% of the total carbon footprint, must be taken into consideration unless they can be justifiably excluded for being either not technically feasible, not practicable, or not cost effective to quantify. Whereas when you look at 14068-1, it says that all direct emission sources, so our scope 1, all energy indirect emission sources, so our scope 2, must be included. And then for the scope 3 equivalent indirect emission sources, it follows the guidance within 14064-1, which essentially tells us that all of the scope 3 emission sources must be identified, they must be evaluated to see which ones are significant to the carbon footprint, and those that are deemed not significant, for instance, it just might not be part of your operations, or it might be not material, then those are justified as well. Moving on to the hierarchy approach. So the terminology hierarchy process is not really used within PAS 2060. It's more of an ISO 14068-1 term. But for PAS 2060, really the approach is looking at quantifying, then reducing, and then offsetting the residual amount. So residual means, what's left at the end after the reductions. And it only speaks of emissions and reductions. Whereas when we look at 14068-1, it has a hierarchy approach of quantifying, then reducing, then removing, and then offsetting the residual amount. So the key difference here is that once you've quantified both of them, you then reduce both of them, But with 14068-1 as well, the next step is to look at removals where possible. So again, aligning to that wider net zero journey, it's looking at removals rather than just purchasing carbon offsets. 14068-1 includes the term removals as part of its methodology throughout the standard. So those of you that have taken a read through it or becoming more familiar with it, then you'll start to see that as well. Okay, so when we consider scope 2, market versus location based, PAS 2060 permits market based reporting, whereas 14068-1 indicates that both methods should be reported. Moving on to carbon credits. So 14068-1 is a lot more extensive than PAS 2060. I won't go through every single one on the screen, but for PAS 2060, you have a table in Annex C, which essentially gives you a list of known offset schemes that comply with the standard. It's very simple, it's very straightforward. If you're applying the standard, you look at one of the examples it gives you, like the gold standard, and you'd go away and apply that. It doesn't differentiate between carbon credit types, it just mentions offsetting. So some of the key differences with 14068-1 is that it does separate its offset criteria. So it has a criteria for the credits themselves, and then it has a criteria for the registry on which they've been procured from. There's a number of different requirements, such as the offsets aren't able to be more than 5 years old. Entities, so those applying the standards have to justify why offsets were purchased rather than being able to make a removal enhancement or take reductions. So we spoke on the last slide around that hierarchy of reducing, removing, and then offsetting. So that's further emphasized in the carbon offset piece. So if you've purchased these offsets, why have they been purchased? Why has removals not taken place? Why has reductions not taken place? Or they may have taken place, but not in full. So it's about having that justification there. They can't be retired. They must be retired, sorry, but no later than 12 months after the end date of the reporting period. Carbon credits that represent GHG emission reductions that have already occurred may be used for a claim of carbon neutrality. So these are usually referred to as ex post carbon credits in the carbon market. So there's a little bit more information on that. It also specifies different types. So it talks about avoidance credits, it talks about reduction credits, and it talks about removal credits. So there's different options there which can be considered when you're applying the standard. And lastly on this, it just emphasizes in the early stages that any type of offset is palatable. However, the preference should always be towards removal. So we've spoken about removals a number of times here. It's present throughout the entirety of the standard. There's a real emphasis for reducing, removing, and offsets being sort of that last point of call. And essentially the amount you offset should deteriorate each year. And that puts you on a pathway towards net zero. Okay, so I think this is the last page of the tables. It is. So we'll run through the differences between the reduction sections and the pathways and target setting. So looking firstly at reductions, PAS 2060, those on the webinar that operate with the standard already will know that within the first year of application, offsets can be used to entirely achieve carbon neutrality. So when you first adopt PAS 2060, you quantify your carbon footprint, you put a reduction plan in place, but that hasn't necessarily been actioned yet, and then you offset the emissions and you achieve carbon neutrality. It doesn't specify a criteria necessarily for reductions. It doesn't say it has to be, in line with science-based targets, or it has to be X amount or anything like that. It just talks about an absolute emission reduction or an intensity-based emission reduction. And it permits accounting for backdated historical emission reductions in the first year. So looking comparatively now at 14068-1, evidence of a reduction, albeit it doesn't tell us to what extent, there's no detail on it, but an evidence of a reduction in carbon emissions is mandatory to happen, to have happened for any reporting cycle. So including the first one, your first time round with 14068-1 being verified, you need to have already achieved a reduction or have evidence of a reduction in carbon emissions. So this will work quite nicely with, the alignment it has with 14064-1. If you're a client that's already worked with that standard and you've had your carbon footprint verified, and then you've implemented a reduction, and then you move on to 14068-1, or you've had your carbon footprint verified with PAS 2060, and then you move over to 14068-1, and we can see where the reduction has taken place. So 14068-1 also requires any emission reduction activity to cause minimal harm or environmental impact. The standard itself favours absolute emission reduction rather than intensity. So whereas PAS 2060, allows for both, this one definitely favours an absolute, so an overall reduction rather than it being based on a metrics. It is permitted, but there needs to be an explanation as to when the applying organisation or product, etc., would achieve an absolute emission reduction in the long term. It also doesn't permit for accounting of backdated emission reductions, whereas PAS 2060 does. So the last piece here is on carbon neutrality pathways and target setting. So for PAS 2060, it has a carbon footprint management plan with planned reductions. And for 14068-1, it goes into a little bit more detail than that. So it requires the subject's carbon neutrality pathway to be based on 3 reduction targets. And that is a short-term reduction target, a long-term reduction target, and a date by which the carbon emissions that are essentially economically and financially feasible to eradicate have been removed. So they're reaching net zero. So the pathways should be based on science-based approaches. So, we have some clients that use science-based targets, guidance and resource out there, or there's other bits of information that can support you, and essentially that will put together your carbon neutrality reduction plan. If the subject's targets differ from science-based methodologies, and that must be explained. So there's a much greater emphasis around net zero and aligning to those future requirements for everyone than there is in PAS 2060. Okay, I'm just a little bit conscious of time. But we've just got, that was the main section there that we needed to get through, and we've just got a section now on the process and benefits of GHG verification and some further support and resource that we'll run through. So what does verification with NQA look like? NQA is a UCAS accredited verification body, so we provide independent third-party GHG verification activities. And NQA ourselves, we are governed by UCAS, and we are controlled by 3 standards, 4 standards that you can see on the screen: 14064-3, 14066, 14065, and 17029. I won't go through what each of those mean, because essentially, that's how that's how we deliver our operations. It's not what our clients need to worry about, essentially. But it ensures that we have, competent, added value, impartial and objective verification work taking place for our clients. NQA is in the process of updating our accreditation from PAS 2060, which we've had for a while now, and moving that over to 14068-1. The application with UCAS to transfer our accreditation over only came out, within the last sort of half of 2024, and we have our UCAS 14068-1 work commencing this month. So hopefully we'll be able to come back and provide some updates on our social media, webinars, etc. once that's all complete, but very much in process at the moment. So what does verification look like? It starts with an application and a quote. The duration and therefore the cost is dependent on a number of things around the assurance level. The majority of our clients are looking at a limited level of assurance. The number of sites within the organisational and reporting boundaries, the scale of emissions in tons of CO2e, and the sector risk and complexity. The verification itself is broken down into 3 stages, and that is a pre-verification, a verification, and a post-verification. Pre-verification is typically only around half a day to a day in duration. It's completed remotely, and we're essentially making sure that everything that needs to be in place is in place. We're putting together a risk analysis, a risk assessment even, and a gap analysis before moving on to the main verification. When we go on to the main verification, this is typically always greater than 2 days, but the duration of what that looks like is going to fluctuate massively dependent of the information we have at the application stage. But here we're likely to have a blend of remote and on-site. We're looking at data sampling and testing and reviewing documentation for conformity. The post-verification is typically half a day remotely, and it's an independent review by another lead verifier to add to the assurance and credibility and the robustness of what we're looking at, to make sure we're ticking all the boxes that we need to for the standard. At the end of that, you're released with something called a verification opinion statement. It looks like a certificate on page 1, something you could print off, pop on the walls, etc. And then the pages subsequent to that are almost like a summarized report with all of your key detail. And it was created in a way so that it works well to sharing with stakeholders, and it's got all of that key information in. So why verify your GHG emissions? The list is extensive, and we could go far beyond what we've got on the screen here, but mainly having visibility on accurate carbon performance itself has a number of benefits, leading on nicely to then having the opportunity to make informed and meaningful reductions because you have accurate data and visibility on what you're doing. You're able to conform with legal and regulatory requirements, which is becoming more and more apparent. We expect to become more and more apparent in the next 25 years. Meeting stakeholder expectations and agreements, lots of our clients and ourselves as well, when you're putting forward for a tender or different types of contracts, there's expectations and agreements there around ESG, sustainability, carbon, alignment with the UN SDGs as well. There's sort of different ways of illustrating that, but the expectation is definitely growing. Potential cost savings by becoming more efficient, improving reputation and brand image, and also preventing the risk of greenwashing claims as well. So the last section we have here is around support and resources, just a couple of slides. So some of the key ways that you can keep an eye out for what NQA is doing in this space, and specifically around the carbon neutrality standards as well. So we have a quarterly sustainability simplified newsletter. So that comes out, the next one is coming out mid-February. There's a link on our website where you can sign yourself up for it, or you can send an email to myself and I can make sure you're registered. Some of you may be on that already. It's got a big photo of my face right on the top, which is always a delight to see when you open your emails first thing in the morning. Definitely not for myself, but what we've got in there is a number of key updates and news items. So any news that we have within the industry, updates on standards, clients that we've successfully taken through and worked with us on a case study, industry topics, the COP events, bits and pieces like that will be in our newsletter. So anything to sort of keep in touch with our sustainability team, it's worth being on that newsletter. We also have a Sustainability Simplified podcast, which is headed up by our Carbon and Sustainability Director, Steve Burt. I think we have around 3 or 4 podcasts out already, and they're planned to come out every couple of months thereafter. So it's worth having a listen to if you're traveling to see a client or on your way somewhere. On top of that, we've got a sustainability dedicated microsite with things like blogs, news items, fact sheets, etc. Training. We have a PAS 2060 to 14068-1 training course, which is 1 day long. We then have a understanding and achieving ISO 14068-1 training course, which is 2 days. So the top one is essentially going into more detail than what we have today around the differences between the two standards and how you move from one to another. And the bottom training course is a fresh sort of introduction to 14068-1 and really carefully going through all the requirements of the standard. See on the screen, you've got our fact sheet for 14068-1 there on the left, and our 2 training courses there as well. So further support, you have some of the details on the screen around our office number, our general email address. You can follow and engage with NQA on LinkedIn and through our website channels as well, because we're always posting and sharing knowledge where possible. You can see the podcast at the bottom and the newsletter as well. So hopefully if there's any sort of follow-ups on the back of this webinar, then you can get in touch through one of these channels or with myself. I haven't seen any more questions come through or any questions come through, so hopefully that means everything's been answered for you, and I haven't sent anyone to sleep. So with that, I will say thank you very much. Hopefully speak to many of you in 2025. Any questions, please get in touch with myself or the contact details, and enjoy the rest of your day.